Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Almost no one fell harder than Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was a Civil War vet who led federal troops against a band of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Tensions between the two groups had been rising since gold was discovered on Native American lands. Many tribes missed a federal deadline to move to reservations, so Custer was dispatched to confront them. Custer was unaware of the number of Indians fighting under the command of Sitting Bull at Little Bighorn, and he and his forces were crushed in one of the worst defeats in American military history, and this was known as Custer's Last Stand. Now, if anyone knows anything about Custer, it's his defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But before this, he was a daring and highly successful cavalry officer. He was called the Boy General of the Union Army at the age of 23, and he was also quite a character. He attended the wedding of a Confederate officer, a friend from West Point, right during the Civil War, and wore his Union blues during the ceremony. He was fond of his Indian scouts and popular with people on both sides of the line. So what if Custer would have survived Little Bighorn? Would he have lived a life of daring and dashing, kind of like a Teddy Roosevelt? Or would he have met his end elsewhere? Today on this episode, I'm talking to Harry Crocker, who wrote a book called Armstrong that actually imagines what would have happened if Custer had survived the Battle of Little Bighorn. In this alternate timeline, Custer tries to clear his name from the humiliating defeat of his last stand, but he does so incognito. And he does so by becoming a gun for hire and joining forces with a group of cancan dancers, Chinese acrobats, and a multilingual Crow Scout. So Harry and I discuss, how do you get into the mind of a historical figure? How do you write in their voice? How do you write counterfactual history? And also about his larger goals of trying to bring frontier America back to life and look at it through the really diverse cast of characters that make up this society. So it's a really interesting discussion, not quite one I've had before on this podcast about alternate history, but I think you'll really like it. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Harry Crocker. Harry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm really curious about your choice of Custer as a protagonist for your alternate history, because for my show, I've been asked a lot about alternate history from the audience, but it almost always has to do with World War II. Once in a while, I'll get a question about the Roman Empire, but rarely is there anything on the Civil War. So for you to choose Custer, what made you choose him as your protagonist?
Well, a few reasons. I mean, one is just when I was a kid, I was fascinated by Custer and Little Bighorn. And in later life, I've written a lot of military history, nonfiction. Several of those books have dealt with the Civil War. And one of the characters who always leapt out at me was Custer for at least a few reasons. One is that he's sort of a walking caricature of himself. He's a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt in that regard. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, the glasses and the teeth and the bully and all that. Well, Custer's sort of, in his own way, the same way. It's true, he had the long, flowing blonde locks. It's true, he was sort of this cavalier figure. And I found him contrary, I thought, to a lot of recent history, with Custer is portrayed as this arrogant, idiotic, genocidal Indian-killing maniac. I found him to be actually quite a admirable, winning, likable figure. It is true he graduated last in his class at West Point, but that was not because he was stupid. It was because he was a prankster. And when his class graduated, he was actually in the brig. He was court-martialed, and he was court-martialed because a fight had broken out between two junior cadets. And as an upperclassman, he was supposed to break it up, but instead, he decided to referee the fight to make sure it was a fair fight. but he does eventually graduate, and he goes straight from West Point to the front. And in the Civil War, he was known as the Boy General. He was promoted to Brigadier General at the age of 23. And he got that promotion because Custer was physically tremendously brave, tremendously daring. He could read land. He was great at assessing enemy troop dispositions. He was a great reconnaissance officer. He actually went up in balloons early in the war to look, which was very dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
You were right up the sharpshooters, but looking over the enemy positions. And one of his patrons became George McClellan, who thought this guy is a comer and made him and started elevating him up the ranks. At Gettysburg, Custer really makes his mark because he is one of the first Union officers to foil the Confederate cavalry. The Confederate cavalry had sort of dominated Union cavalry until that battle, and Custer is right at the forefront there, leading from the front, leading his Michiganders against Jeb Stuart's Confederates. Also during the war, Custer exemplified a couple of things that I just, to my mind, are really admirable. He was a man who was magnanimous and loyal. And to give you probably the most striking example to me is that at West Point, many of Custer's friends were Southerners. They actually shared many of the same political ideas. Custer was a conservative Democrat. He sympathized and liked the sort of whole Confederate chivalry aspect of their social life. But during the war, he attended the wedding of a Confederate officer at a plantation house in Virginia. He went there dressed in his Union blue, the Confederate officer in his Confederate gray, and being Custer, he decided to hang around after the wedding and flirt with the Southern belles for about a week. And throughout the war, he was very, very gracious, sought out Confederate friends of his, former cadets on the other side of the line, would wave his hat and ride across the lines to greet them and whatnot. And likewise, after the war, when he became eventually an Indian fighter, people say, he was this only good Indian is a dead Indian type, which is what Phil Sheridan said. But no, that's not actually what Custer believed. Custer actually liked the Indians. Custer actually, among his best friends were his Indian scouts. And why? It's because he actually wrote this. He said, look, if I were an Indian, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, if I were an Indian, I wouldn't want to be cooped up on a reservation. I would want to be out hunting and fighting and riding along the plains. That's the sort of person he was. He admired the Indians. It is true, he didn't like some of their what he would consider more barbaric habits. He certainly didn't like them killing settlers and whatnot, but he actually sympathized both in the Civil War and in the Indian Wars with people he thought were honorable opponents in many ways.
It's interesting that you make the comparison with Teddy Roosevelt because he's a mascot of manly American bravado and fearlessness. But it sounds like there's similarities with Custer. But if anyone knows anything about Custer, and they typically only know one thing, if that thing, of Little Bighorn, and then they take that event and project it backward on his life. Do you think this was an aberration that if he had not died, then he would have had a life that would be celebrated sort of like Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, up to a point. Custer was a famously successful officer. There was a phrase in his Custer's luck, because Custer's luck seemed to play out in battle after battle after battle. His luck ran out, obviously, at Little Bighorn, and one of the taking off points of the book is he assumes he's been betrayed. And part of when he survives in the book, when he survives Battle of Little Bighorn, one of his missions is to try to find out who set him up, why he was not supported as he thought he should have been by subordinate officers Benteen and Reno. But Custer was a prominent figure at that time. Custer was in the doghouse because, for among other reasons, he had criticized the way that Indian traders operated in the West. And among those Indian traders were President Grant's brother. Grant was a Republican with no love lost for Custer, who was a Democrat, and there were some voices who said that Custer could perhaps someday become a presidential candidate. So he was in some ways a celebrated figure. He was also, though, a controversial figure. He was very interested in politics, though he actually often tried to avoid it. He liked talking politics, but he knew it was bad for his career. And he also knew that really when push came to shove, he was a soldier. I think the thing that it might hurt Custer's reputation to this day is, it may sound like a cliche, but sort of political correctness run amok yet again. And the reason why I say this is because last year, there was this fast food outlet called Sonic. You might see their commercials during college football games. And they had a short-lived commercial which had one of the characters dressed up like Custer, and the whole routine was this mistaken use of the word Custer versus custard. But this completely inoffensive silly commercial was yanked after a week because the very mention of Custer's name or the portrayal of him in a sympathetic or comic light was seen as offensive to Indians. And I think if you view in my day, we used to think of how the West was won. If you think of the conquest of the West, the winning of the West as a heroic thing, well, then Custer would be a hero. If you think of it as a genocidal thing, as this unjustifiable conquest of this territory, then Custer would still be in the doghouse, I reckon.
Right. He's definitely not an emblem of the Western machine or the American military machine rolling over the frontier. So lots to unpack there. One other thing before we get into your counterfactual narrative, and I think you're the first author of an alternate history book. How do you get into the mind of the character to write in their voice and imagine what they would do had things played out differently? What does that process look like to research?
Yeah, well, I had done a lot of research on Custer in the past for a couple of previous books I had written, one in particular. And I thought I knew him pretty well, but I did, of course, boned up again in preparation for the book. And one thing that led me to believe I'd started to get it right was I had created in the character, without knowing this is actually true, that he's very concerned with his hygiene. He packs this foldable toothbrush in the book. That turned out to be true. That's what out. After I had written that as part of his character, based on my previous trying to get under Custer's skin. So I figured, look, if I am now inventing things which actually were true, I think I've got it pretty well.
This is another thing I'm curious about. When you're writing a story that's digestible to modern readers, but he's speaking in the voice of a 19th century person, have you just read enough that you can get yourself mentally that you can write in the voice of a mid-19th century figure, or did you have to compile a master document of Custerisms that you would slip in? I'm just curious about that process.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that was actually something I had to wrestle with a little bit, because the style of writing, Custer did actually write a book, wrote pieces about his life on the plains. And his wife actually wrote a couple books about their life on the plains together, their lives together. But it's a little bit too ornate for modern taste. I mean, it's perfectly readable and whatnot, but the book is actually written as a letter to his wife. And so I took that as an excuse to update his language slightly, but very carefully, because he never uses a word or makes a comparison with things that are not 19th century lingo or technology or usage. But it's just a little bit easier to go. It's a little bit more lucid, a little briefer. Hidden throughout are things he actually said or wrote, just modestly changed to fit the very conversational tone of the book. The book is written for someone who is impatient.
There you go.
Because it is written, it's meant to be, this is not a sales pitch, this is actually a conscious thing I was writing. I wanted to make it so that a reader would never get bored. So it's full of action, it's full of jokes. The book is actually a comedy, believe it or not. It's a comic tale. And it's meant to be snappy in its dialogue and in the sort of prose he writes in this long letter to his wife.
Hey everyone, I'd like to take a short break in this episode to tell you about a way that you can both help this show and get free food out of the deal. This episode is brought to you by HelloFresh, a meal delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients so you can just cook, eat, and enjoy. I've heard about meal delivery services on podcasts before, but I really enjoyed HelloFresh when I tried it out. And when I mentioned this company to my sister, she said that what she likes about it compared to other companies is that you get really interesting recipes, but it's not so exotic that it's hard for your kids to get into. Recently, I made chicken pineapple quesadillas, and my kids definitely got into it. They told me that it looked like food at a restaurant, and that's not a comment that I've ever received for anything I've made.